So I'm pleased to welcome my special guest tonight, Andrew Cook. He's got a fantastic new book called Capital Gains. But for those who don't know your history, just give us a bit of your backstory as a historian and just civil service
Sure,
and everything else you've done.
sure. Well, basically, I've spent since 2002. That was when the first book came out, and I've been a historian for many years, teaching in different institutions and researching. And I suppose one of the common questions I've had, not just about this book, but about other things, is when people look at all the books I've written in the past, they say, "Oh, great, a Beatles book, but hold on, what's that got to do with MI5 or
Yeah,
Jack the Ripper or whatever? There's no theme here." And my sort of reply is, well, the kind of is, because all of those books were written for one simple motive, one simple reason, because I found through research and through tracking various people down either a new take on something or completely new material, which on the whole hadn't been sort of mined before. And that's exactly what happened with the Beatles book. So when you look at it, it does look a little bit crazy. There's no rhyme or reason to these books, but as I say, that they're all basically glued together with what we used to call closed sources or lost material or whatever. So that's the kind of you know fit for it all.
yeah. So are you a Beatles fan, or how did you come to want to write about Capital?
Sure, sure. Well, I'm most certainly a Beatles fan. In fact, I was just trying to think the other day when I first heard the Beatles. I think I must have been about seven. But I've got two cousins, and they're both about a decade older than me. So whenever my mum and dad used to sort of take me around their place and chatting to their parents, I was kind of sent upstairs with them and sitting on the bed, listening to them playing their Beatles records. Of course, I didn't know at that time, that it was the Beatles, but I mean that's how I got into it to start with. So yeah, most certainly, a big Beatles fan.
Yeah. So as a historian, it's good to be able to maybe take an objective look at an element of the Beatles story,
Mm,
because something I've done with the various books I've done is try and remain objective
yeah.
about the topic. But what was it about Capitol Records that appealed to you? What got you into writing about Capitol Records?
Sure, absolutely. Well, another thing I kind of mention in the preface to the book is how I first came across Beatles records and say, yeah, I listened to my cousins, and when they got married, it's back in the day, a bit like that old Likely Lads episode where they, Bob and Thelma are getting married, and Thelma says, "You're not bringing all your junk back to this new house." So they all had to sort of junk their stuff, and they said, "Oh, Andrew, do you want these old Beatles records and whatever?" And I said, "Yeah, please."
Yeah.
So that's how it started. But interestingly, the Capitol thing, I mean, where we used to live when I was a kid, when I was about 11, this sort of mega record store opened called FL Moores, and it was totally different to any record store I'd seen before. Most record stores I'd seen were almost like little corner shops, or
Yeah.
a department in Woolworths or somewhere like that. But this was like, I don't know what it was like. It was like an aircraft hangar, and much the annoyance of my dad, I went spent a whole day there
Oh
just
yeah.
exploring the thing, and obviously one of the first things I made a beeline for was the Beatles albums, and I was thumbing through them. Obviously, I knew most of the albums. I'd seen them before in Boots or wherever,
Yeah.
but then I came across these what later turned out to be Capitol, and I thought, well, hang on about a minute, these are Beatles albums, but I've never seen them before. That
Yeah.
they seem to be brighter, more in your face, and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
I was going to buy one, but then I noticed the price on it was £6 50, which sounds nothing
Rip
these
off.
days. But when absolutely, I mean, UK albums were about 225 in 1971,
I remember those
and
days.
absolutely, and the US album was about six something. So you can imagine it was a good while for me to save up my my paper round money
Yeah.
to get one or two of those. But yeah, that's how it started, and that's how the kind of fascination with the Capitol thing started. When I actually got a proper job when I left university, I then made a beeline for HMV in Oxford
Of
Street, and
course.
over a period of months, gradually, sort of bought them all. But yeah, so that was where the sort of fascination started. And again, an old friend of mine, or still a friend of mine who lives in the States, his sort of job in inverted commas is a genealogist, and he came across, this is about talking about 2008 now. He came across an estate where a guy had passed away. He was asked to look into it all, and one thing that made his ears prick up, because again he was a Beatles fan as well and still is. He said, "Oh, this guy, he dropped me a line and said this guy used to work for Capitol Records," and it all sprung from there.
Oh,
So we were able to track down a number of people who had worked for Capitol, admittedly, not at the top of the tree, not people like Alan Livingston or all these big noise
yeah,
people who had all put their own special version down. These were people who were middle ranking at best, flies on the wall, and had I thought, pretty accurate stories to tell. That they had no motivation for glossing it or making or
exactly.
spinning it or making it better than it was or putting themselves in the starring role. They were just sort of reeling off their recollections of things that had happened while they were working there.
So give us a bit of the background then on Capitol Records, because obviously there was this controversy when you got EMI, Parlophone,
Mm.
and Capitol. But what's the background to Capitol before we get into the Beatles bit?
Absolutely. I mean, the thing I learned as I sort of dug deeper and deeper was that on its own, I mean, Capitol is a really fascinating story. I mean, like the Beatles themselves, they started from almost nothing, and within a decade, they were one of the top five labels in the States. When they were created, if you like, in California, in Hollywood, in 1942, it was two rooms above a record store,
Wow.
and there were about five guys crammed into these two rooms, and within 5 6 years, they were growing like nobody's business. And by the time you get to the mid 50s, they're trying to nudge into the top four against RCA Victor, Columbia, Decca. And yeah, so it's a fascinating story, Capitol on its own. As you rightly say, in 1955, EMI come along and buy them, and it's a bit like, for anyone watching who's ever seen Mad Men, that American drama series. It struck a chord there because people all remember in Mad Men it's it's an advertising agency, not a record label, but against the grain, they're bought up by some snooty run, London bunch of UK advertisers who haven't got a clue what's going on, and they buy this cutting edge American ad agency. Same thing with Capitol. I mean, I think one or two people there said, God, we've been bought by limeys, and these people
Yeah.
are, 2 decades behind what we're doing. And when they're invited over to EMI in London to see how the Brits do it, they're more or less speechless. Apart from a guy, who will feature in this story later, Dave Dexter, who
Yeah.
is always someone who says what he wants to say and he doesn't care who he upsets. But Dexter was just stunned by the sort of Stone Age, organization there. EMI were the last people. Oh no, we're 12-inch albums, they'll never catch on here.
Yeah.
And it was so, and Abbey Road, yeah, lovely place, lovely building, but the recording equipment you've got here would have been fantastic in the 1920s and 30s, but you need to come and see our space age recording studios at Capitol Tower in Los Angeles. And when people like George Martin and all the other guys go over there, again, their jaws drop. It's almost like Mission Control. It's not a
Yeah.
recording studio. So yeah, Capitol on its own. I mean, I could have, well, I didn't, but I mean, I could have written a book on Capitol. But yeah, but when you combine the story of Capitol, story of the Beatles together, you've got a really powerful mix, I think, really.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those interesting things with the story of, so EMI owned Capitol,
Yeah,
but they had autonomy as well, didn't they? Which
he did.
causes the
It was
conflict.
Yeah, I mean, it follows a pattern because EMI negotiated the world's most awful business deal with Capital. I mean, Capital must have been struggling to keep a straight face when Joseph Lockwood put this deal in front of them, because basically EMI were just shoveling spade loads of money on them and literally asking very little in return. As you rightly say, Capital had a cast iron veto. In other words, EMI in London couldn't say, "Oh, can you put out this, Mrs. Mills album or something?"
Yeah.
They say, "Sorry, mate, that's just not going to sell over here," and there would be no ifs and buts about it. Capital had a cast iron right to
Yeah.
decide what went out on their label.
So let's talk about Mr. Dexter then.
Yeah,
He's
absolutely. Fascinating character. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
because obviously 63, the Beatles are now getting popular, number one album, number one singles, and George Martin, Parlophone, EMI is saying to Capitol, right, these are the big happening new band, put the records
Mm,
out, and Capitol say no.
mm.
What was
Three
their
times.
raison d'etre? Yeah,
Yeah, I think actually it's one of the few things in this story which is as simple and straightforward as it looks. Um, Dexter actually wasn't doing anything that any other international A&R man hadn't done before at RCA, at Columbia, or whatever. He was looking at this and listening to it and saying, "Well, it's British, it's not going to catch on here." And obviously we've got the ability to look back from the 21st century and almost laugh.
yeah, yeah,
How can somebody say that? But at the time, it might have been disagreeable to the folk in London, but it wasn't as if Decker was a man on a man alone, a man on an island, coming out with some terrible individual view. You could have asked almost any big time A&R person in America, and they would
yeah.
have probably said the same thing as Dave Dexter, and they did, most of them.
Well, that's it. And obviously, then the Beatles records come out, on VJ, on Swan, and as
Mm,
records being released without a big promo campaign,
yeah.
nothing happens to them. At
Mm,
which point, Dexter's probably saying, "Well, I told you so," because
yeah.
nobody from Britain really had made it, had they?
Absolutely not. I mean, Cliff Richard, okay, he got one top 30 hit in America, but that was Living Doll. And you could argue it was the song that got it into the top 30. It wasn't Cliff Richard. I mean, you
Yeah,
had, lots of Elvis clones. Everybody was grabbing a tub of Brill cream and a comb and
yeah,
trying to do weird things with the top lip, as it were. Adam Faith, he didn't even get a boo in the top charts. Billy Fury, all of these big shots in the UK were
yeah,
just getting nowhere. Okay, I think Telstar got to number one,
yeah,
Bilk, but again, that was the song. It wasn't the fact that all of those Yanks were suddenly enthralled by the bloke in the bowler hat and all the rest of it, or
yeah.
the tornadoes. It was the sound, and it was a one-off. It was what we still call a one-hit wonder. So yeah, it was not just breaking through. It was pushing against almost decades of history that dictated, if it ain't from America, it ain't worth listening to.
Yeah. And I suppose that in a way, considering what was in the charts in the US at the time,
Mm,
the Beatles sound was quite radically different. That they'd had the early rock and
absolutely,
roll of Elvis, Little
absolutely,
Richard, Chuck Berry, but then
absolutely.
they got all bobbied, hadn't they, and
Well, that's
poppy.
it. Yeah, you took the words out of my mouth. I think it was Jerry Lee Lewis, if I'm not mistaken, who said that in '63 the US music scene was dominated by the Bobbies. So you've got Bobby V, Bobby Riddell, God knows how many other. I can't remember them now, but he was right. I mean, the kind of what you might call almost hardcore rock and roll that the Beatles and a number of other British bands were into at the time, that had kind of melted around about 61, I would have
Yeah,
thought. And it was very poppy. You had the Beach Boys, you had a couple of other people around, but the overwhelming majority of chart acts were very poppy, very sugary. Yeah, so you can understand that, I think, in a
yeah,
way. But that was a good thing in a way, because I think if the Beatles
absolutely.
if the Beatles had tried to break through 3 or 4 years earlier, they would have been up against some pretty good rock and roll acts. But by '63, a lot of them had faded away. I mean, Jerry Lee Lewis was struggling to get a hit. Chuck Berry in the States, Elvis was in Hollywood singing God knows what. Even he didn't want to even he didn't want to sing it, let alone buy it. So
Yeah,
it was a good and a bad time to
yeah,
break through, I think.
yeah. And I think with it's all those things, serendipitous events that happen. Obviously, Beatlemania is coined after the Sunday night
Mm.
at London Palladium.
Yeah, definitely.
And CBS send over their crew who show that
Mm.
on the morning of the JFK assassination, and of course it shelved for a little bit.
Mm.
And then I love the story of Marcia Albert and the I Want to
Mm.
Hold Your Hand,
Yeah.
playing the British record and Capitol objecting.
Yeah.
So the thing that's always puzzled me is,
Mm.
what was it that changed their mind? Was it Brian Epstein going over there? What was it that made them suddenly go, I tell you what, no, let's put $40,000 into a promotional campaign and take over
Mm.
everywhere at Christmas? What
Yeah.
changed?
Yeah. And I think you've hit the nail on the head. That's the number one. If you had to tear out one page from the book, it's all about that. Because that's the thing that's always puzzled me. Because
Mm.
when I read 3 or 4 totally, utterly different versions of how this miracle was supposed to have happened, a cynic has got to say, well, hold on a minute. you
Yeah,
know we've got at least 2 or 3 that are wrong, and in fact they all might be wrong. Let's just pick 2 examples. I mean, there's George Martin's version where, out of pure frustration, it varies from story to story, but Lockwood or White or somebody else, LG Wood, allegedly pick up the phone and
yeah,
breathe fire down the line and read Capital the Riot Act and say, you're going to put this out, no ifs or buts, we own you. Well, never happened. Never
no,
happened. If you look at the company documents in the UK, company documents in the States, it doesn't add up. That never happened. Alan Livingston had an even more crazy story where, one day the phone rings, this bloke he'd never heard of, Brian Epstein. How Epstein managed to get through to the president of
exactly.
Capitol, a bloke who's never even heard of. Let's brush that aside for a minute. But with, Epstein says, "Oh, why aren't you putting this record out?" And he says, "I've never heard it. I've never." Well, he has heard it. He has seen, he's heard all about it and whatever. And then, he says, "Oh, hang on, I'll go and get I'll go and listen." And he comes back and rings him back and says, "I've heard it. It's great. I'll sign him up." And then Epstein, a man who would have sawn his own right arm off with a rusty razor blade, then allegedly almost blows the whole deal by saying, "Well, you can't have the record unless you promise me to spend $40,000 on it." And then Livingston says, "Yeah, no problem. Thanks, Mr. Epstein. Bye." I mean, that is the most, crazy, weird, nonsense story
Oh,
ever. And there are
revisionism, isn't
three or
it?
four of them. So that's why I call the beginning of my book The Way It Wasn't, because we just talk a little bit about all the crazy, stupid
Yeah,
stories that have surfaced over the years. Um, how did it happen? Well, it's a very interesting story, and I'll try and keep it brief. There was a guy called Lou Levy. He was a big shot in New York publishing. He'd been around since the big bands in the 30s. One day, a guy brings him, as he describes, a hungry-looking kid with a guitar. Now, he feels sorry for the hungry-looking kid because it doesn't look like the hungry-looking kid has eaten for several days. So he takes him off for a cheesecake or something. And in the end, he ends up giving the kid a publishing deal for a half a dozen songs or whatever for 500. The stories vary, whether it's $100 or $500. And the kid has got an album coming out in a couple of weeks, but it bombs. It sells hardly any copies. CBS, the record company, want to ditch him. The producer wants to give him one more chance. Eventually, against their better judgment, they give him one more chance. And Levy is starting to think, what a waste of money! What a waste of money! And then the next thing that happens is that the hungry-looking kid is signed up by a manager. The manager takes him to another music publisher, doesn't realize he's already signed a publishing deal with Lou Levy, introduces him to a big shot at Warner Publishing. This guy, he signs on the dotted line, and then a couple of days later, he says to the guy at Warner, by the way, does it mean anything that I've already signed a publishing deal with somebody else? And this bloke goes absolutely ballistic. The air turns blue, several times over. And he says, what the, you mean you've signed up with somebody else? You can't have two publishing contracts, my friend. So his manager says, well, look, here's again, it varies. Was it $100? Was it $500? Here's the money. Go to Lou Levy, give him a hard luck sob story, and say, look, you're so despondent at the failure of your album. You're quitting music. Here's the money back. Would he be willing to tear up the contract? Lou Levy thinks it's Christmas. He's got his money back, and whatever. He starts to regret his actions when about a month later, a folk group called Peter, Paul and Mary get to #1, and apparently the hungry looking kid wrote the song. What's the name of the hungry looking kid? Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan. So, Levy is now semi-suicidal. He's getting paranoid. Every time he goes into a club, he believes everybody's looking at him and whispering, oh, there goes the guy who signed Bob Dylan to a publishing contract, and then he got cold feet and all the rest of it. So Levy is almost like an American Bob Rowe in the sense of...
I've just seen it's decorated and Dick Rowe all over again.
Absolutely.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
So how does this connect with Beatles? Well, obviously, Brian Epstein had lots of contacts with people, and he heard just before he was about to go to the States. You mentioned he went to the States, I think it was in October, November, and he heard a story. Lou Levy's right-hand man, who was actually born in the UK, he immigrated as a kid. He was in Denmark Street, and somebody overheard him, laughing and joking about poor old Lou Levy and all the rest of it. And Epstein then did some digging and found out eventually that, lo and behold, Lou Levy is a mate of Dave Dexter. Dave Dexter was the editor of a number of music magazines, a bit like America's NME or whatever, in the 1940s. And when Dexter lived in New York, as he did for quite a while, he and Levy and a bunch of other music nuts were really close mates. So when he goes over to the States, to New York, he gets a guy called, I think, Jeffrey Ellis to get a meeting together with an intermediary. Eventually they meet face to face Lou Levy and say, I mean, just paraphrasing, I wasn't a fly on the wall. I'm just putting two and two together and hoping I'm getting something around about 4. And must have said to him something like, look, you can do us a big favor, Lou. Get on to your mate Dave Dexter. Tell him to pull his finger out. Tell him to tell Alan Livingston that the Beatles actually might be a great band to sign. And they said, there's one more thing, promotion. If we can offer Capitol, $40,000 was an absolute fortune at the time. I mean, I don't think an Elvis record, RCA never spent $40,000 promoting an Elvis record. You might say they didn't need to after a while, but so that was the deal. What does Levy get out of this? Well, in exchange for, whispering in the ear of his old mate Dave Dexter and putting $40,000 on the table to sweeten the deal, he's told that if he manages to make all of this work and Capitol agree to put out I Want to Hold Your Hand, he gets the publishing of the B-side. I saw her standing there. Leeds Music, Duchess Music, that's his company. And in addition to that, he gets all the Lennon-McCartney publishing in Australia, New Zealand and Southeast Asia. That's Leeds Music. It all comes even better for Levy in the summer, autumn of '64, when Universal, who are the only big movie company at the time that don't own a publishing company, decide to make Levy an offer he can't refuse. Even today, I mean, someone might be able to find it. I couldn't, and lots of people I asked couldn't. The amount of money that Leeds music was bought for by Universal, but
Yeah.
rumor has it it's the biggest, you know, deal amount of money that's ever been paid for a publishing company. Levy then becomes president of the new Universal Stroke Duchess, and you know, he's in heaven, you know. So that's
What, a 12
basically
months?
that's a very long and drawn out story, but it basically answers the question: what made Capitol change their minds? Well, in order for Capitol to change their minds, Dexter has to change his, and Levy was the one who tapped his old mate on the shoulder and said, you know, you need to sort this out, Dave. You need to get your mates at you know, Alan Livingston, whatever. You need to convince them that you've been on the road to Damascus. You're now persuaded that you know, the Beatles are a great act
Yeah.
to sign for Capitol. And by the way, what's more, here's $40,000. So yeah, it's an incredible story.
And that makes logical sense now,
Mm,
because
mm.
I've read so many variations and none of
Yeah.
them seem to fit.
Yeah, yeah. And again, this is backed up by LG Wood, because again, George Martin, he's part of George Martin's, you know, hokum story where, you know, he goes over to America and apparently reads the Riot Act. He doesn't. He actually is in New York, and LG Wood says, you know, if the Capitol thing hadn't come off, I was literally just about to walk into the offices of an old mate of mine at CBS at Columbia, and they would have almost certainly signed the band up. Which makes sense later, because it's the
Mm.
same guy at Columbia who signs up all the other Decca rejects, you know, like the Yardbirds and the Hollies and all
Yeah.
these other folk, you know. So there was obviously a hotline open with Columbia as a plan B if the sort of Lou Levy wheeze hadn't worked.
Yeah. And I suppose with those DJs around the country starting to play I Want to Hold Your
Mm.
Hand and getting
Added
good
momentum, I think.
feedback,
Yeah.
that
Mm.
would have helped as well. So that then
Yeah.
makes sense of all these
Yeah.
different strands coming together.
Yeah. I think
With
everything fell into place, as you say. Definitely.
yeah, that makes sense now.
Mm.
Then of course they couldn't believe their luck when
No.
obviously it goes to number one and we have the Ed Sullivan Show.
Yeah.
And then suddenly, you know, you got Capitol putting stuff out, you got Swan and VJ rushing albums and singles out,
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
these competing with each other.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then it goes mad from there on.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we probably share a similar view about you know, Beatles history, if you like, in terms of not just the sort of, you know, the research and adding it all up and looking at it logically, and not getting involved in what I call reverse research, where
Oh yeah,
people get silly ideas in their head. So they've almost got the last chapter before they even start the book, and they then work backwards, you know,
yeah,
hoovering up, you know, the silliest piece of evidence, as long
yeah.
as it backs up their theory. You know, history, and I've always said as well, music history is no different to the Romans or you know, the Christopher Columbus or World War One. It's the same kind of thing. The rules apply,
Yeah.
all, you know, all along. You look at the evidence, and then, you know, whether or not it's the theory that you're particularly in love with, you go with the conclusion. You might not even like it yourself, but that's the conclusion. Where the evidence is, you go where the evidence is. So
Yeah,
yeah, to me, that's what it's all about. But
yeah. And if only more authors would do that. Yeah,
yeah,
because when you
absolutely.
share a passion for history,
Yeah,
you've got to follow the history. You've got to follow the evidence,
yeah.
the corroboration, and
Mm.
get to the
That's
stage.
exactly what I remember watching an interview with you a long time ago. You were talking about, you know, whether or not the June '62, whether the contract was already cut and dry. And what you did there, what you demonstrated there, is exactly what I'm saying. It's looking at the evidence and going with the evidence.
Yeah,
You know, and the evidence, 9 times out of 10, the evidence gives you a crystal clear conclusion. You know, not
and
everybody's going
that's
to.
the fun of it. You know,
Yeah,
of taking something which is almost like accepted wisdom and thinking, okay,
yeah,
I'll follow that, and then suddenly going, hang on,
yeah.
and that for me is the thrill and the excitement of
Yeah,
the
yeah,
research, of not going with any
absolutely.
preconceived ideas,
No,
saying, okay, let's follow
absolutely.
it,
Yeah,
and then you get the surprises then, don't you?
Absolutely. I mean, in a perverse kind of way, the Beatles' conquest of America is a bit like the Norman conquest of England in 1066. There's that, what's that old saying? It's the winners who write the history. So, it's people like Alan Livingston, Brian Epstein, George Martin, no criticisms, but I mean, they're the people whose story, retrospective story,
Yeah.
there's a lot of grains of truth in their story, don't get me wrong, but they've got the paintbrush out and given it a nice spruce up and all the rest of it. We are left almost with what's handed down to us, written by people who have got a little bit of an interest in the version of events.
Yeah.
But
And it's like you were saying at the beginning about it's finding those people at Capital who aren't at the very, very top, at the middle management. And I've always
yeah,
found it's, in all the interviews I've done over the years, it's those people who were close to the inner circle, but not actually in it. It's those who are there
absolutely.
because they don't have the same invested interest, the same bias.
Mm,
And you get
mm,
a much more reliable account from them. Because as you were saying,
absolutely.
they've got nothing to win or lose by it.
Mm,
They're quite happy to
mm,
just say, oh, this is what happened. It's
yeah,
more
yeah.
believable.
Absolutely. It's like national history or World War II or whatever. Yeah, you can read a book by General this or Prime Minister that, and it's probably a very readable, entertaining book, but it's not going to be, the absolute God's truth about what happened. It's been glossed a bit. So Beatles history exactly the same as any other type of history, I think.
Yeah, it's like with the Beatles anthology, which is
Mm.
absolutely fantastic. But it's the Beatles' history as they want you to know it.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. It's
And
like that.
they're the worst eyewitnesses to Beatles
Oh,
history
absolutely.
ever.
Yeah, yeah. It's like saying, I always remember that sentence. So we told Brian we're not going to America until we've got number one. Well, the Ed Sullivan thing, that was the ink was dry on that before they even had the contract with Capitol Records. So there we go. But that's life. That's what makes life so interesting, I think.
Well, it does. So we've got them Beatles onto Ed Sullivan, and then probably the controversial thing. It's like you were saying before about having the British LPs.
Yeah.
Capital then don't just want to take the British LPs as Parlophone put
Mm.
them out. They
Yeah.
want to do their own versions.
Yeah.
So that must have caused tension between the two.
I think it did. I think it did. But I think we've also got to remember that again, it's a bit like going back to what we were saying a few minutes ago about Capitol turning down the Beatles. Dexter was doing nothing different from
No.
any other label A&R guy. And it's the same thing with these unique, let's call them unique albums that Capitol did. It wasn't just Capitol. I mean, in this country, when Elvis stuff came out on HMV in the UK, HMV in London cobbled together their own Elvis albums or messed around with the tracks. I remember I've got something buried away somewhere, Elvis Presley #2. Go to America, you won't find Elvis Presley #2 anywhere because it don't exist. It's something that was cobbled up by HMV. One of the guys who was interviewed in the book, I think he said something like, it's nothing peculiar to Capitol. You look at all the Rolling Stones stuff on London, that's all been regurgitated.
Yeah.
Even Jimi Hendrix, I mean, okay, he's American, but he was discovered in the UK. If you look at his albums, particularly Are You Experienced, his first album, if you look at them, the US album, the UK album, different sleeves, different tracks on there. So whether we love or hate those albums or don't care less, we've got to take the view that it's nothing special to the Beatles. It was
Yeah.
something that people did all over the world. Even when you look at Australia, when you look at Southeast Asia, whatever, all of those different places around the world all took the view that we know our own back garden. We will, within reason, maybe just tinker around with these
Yeah.
albums, different sleeves. I mean, Australia more or less followed the same pack drill as UK Parlophone, but there were several album sleeves that were totally and utterly different. They put out 2 albums in Australia that never came out in England. So it's nothing new. What Capitol did, it was going on in America, it was going on in the UK. As I say, Yardbirds, everybody had that done to their albums.
Yeah.
And I don't think the majority cared less because they made a shed load of money. And who's going to stick the tongue out at an album, whether you like it or not, that's actually going to buy you a new house?
Yeah.
I think it's that simple.
Yeah. And again, it's like you're saying there. Each country knows their market. And
Yeah,
if that
definitely.
has got a proven track record of how you market an album, number of tracks on an album,
Yeah,
then you've got to go with their instincts. And it's not
yeah,
always, that the Brits have
yeah,
got it right, even though we
yeah,
sort of think we
yeah.
have a God-given right to think everything we do is right. It doesn't necessarily mean
Absolutely,
we
yeah,
have.
yeah. Well, that's the thing, I mean, people seem to think that, British fans, I think, and who can blame them? I think we're under the impression that these albums that were coming out in the UK that, people bought with the Beatles for sale, that every Beatles fan in the world was doing the same thing and listening to the same album. The British record market, was like a couple of grains of sand on a beach.
Yeah,
And I think I said somewhere in the book that, let's just imagine. I don't think it's very difficult to do, but let's just imagine the Beatles didn't break in America. At best, they would have probably ended up perhaps a little bit better off than Cliff Richard and Adam Faith, because they had just really conquered Britain, a couple of Scandinavian countries. They may or may not have caught on eventually in Australia, but the let's be blunt about it, the fortune they earned in the States through Capitol and stadium tours
oh yeah,
made them what they were. There'd have been no big houses in Surrey, or
no,
Rolls Royces and all this kind of
yeah.
stuff. That just wouldn't have been the case.
They
So,
were on a penny a record, weren't they? So I mean,
well, it was actually, that's interesting. It was the band were on a penny a record.
yeah,
The individual Beatles allegedly got a quarter of a penny each, but it was actually worse than that, because
mm,
Jeffrey Ellis actually said, well, they were on a lot less than that, because after NEMS had taken their 20% bite out of the farthing, they weren't left with an awful lot.
no,
And
no,
then, Alan Klein comes along later, manages the Stones, gets them an absolutely incredible
yeah.
deal, and the Beatles are sitting there dribbling out the corner of their mouth at the sight of the Rolling Stones, who were, in their eyes, obviously, at least the number twos, if not
Yeah,
further down the queue. And
yeah,
they'd got this absolute incredible deal from London and Decca that
yeah.
Klein had engineered. So
And of
so
course,
yeah,
I mean,
the EMI
yeah,
thing was terrible. Yeah,
yeah. And of course, George Martin had sort of gone in and said, "Look, we've got to give him a better rate." He
yeah,
negotiated up to a penny and a half or something, didn't he?
yeah,
And
absolutely.
that was it.
Yeah, and poor old George Martin. I mean, he finds himself in the same boat. I mean, he
Yeah,
eventually quits EMI because they're really just, I was going to say something else there, but they were not treating seriously his
no,
demand for better money. And of course, he'd been to Capitol himself and seen that, producers, A&R men in the States, actually got a royalty on the records they produced. He got no royalty
no.
whatsoever for the millions of records the Beatles were selling in the UK, and he was literally being treated by people like LG Wood as a tea boy. And who can
Yeah,
blame him and the other guys leaving EMI
no.
and setting up their own shop?
And it's almost them thinking, well, EMI is right, and look at those idiots at Capital. But as
Yeah,
you're saying,
absolutely.
Capital
Yeah,
are,
yeah,
light years ahead of
yeah,
where
yeah.
EMI were at.
Absolutely, it's a bit like that old joke about the guy who's driving up the wrong side of the M1 and saying, what's going on? Why is everybody driving the wrong way? Why is everybody driving towards me? Well, you're in the wrong lane.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
so yeah, I mean, EMI. I mean, there was, again, I think I commented on something in there where EMI had this sort of, strap line on all their albums for about 20 years. EMI, the world's leading recording organization. After 1961, they weren't even Britain's leading recording organization, let alone the world. And if it wasn't for the Beatles, they'd have probably gone to the wall in the mid 60s, not in 2011.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. I mean,
yeah,
that's it. The Beatles contributed so much and got so little in return.
yeah,
Obviously, one of the controversial Capitol albums was with the cover of the Butcher album, as it's
yeah,
become known.
yes.
Tell us about that, because that's such a
Sure.
story.
Well, it is, and the album itself is a sort of fascinating album. But I mean, I think it underlines something that Tony Barrow said retrospectively. I mean, of course, as you know, and all your listeners know, Tony Barrow came up with that phrase, the Fab Four. But he also came up with a much less known phrase, which was the Last Supper. For when he was looking back and describing 1966. Quite what he meant by that, there's different interpretations, but I mean, basically, he's saying that 1966 was the turning point. Before 66, the Beatles, on the whole, followed hook, line, and sinker what Brian Epstein told them, but the balance of power is slowly changing. So by 66, it's the other way around. Epstein is now, not exactly the lapdog, but he's conscious of the fact his management contract is up in 67, the record deal is up in 66. The Beatles are already a nose out of joint because they now realise what an awful deal they've got with EMI. Salt has been rubbed into the wound by talking to Mick and Keith about this amazing deal that the Stones have got. They're tripping over money. The Stones, they don't know what to do with it. When, for example, and I think this is one of the examples that Barrow uses, when he says before 66 there was this unwritten rule that a decision wasn't made unless all four Beatles were in favour of it. A bit like the Three Musketeers or whatever. One for all and whatever. But in 66, according to Barrow, again, we weren't there, we weren't flies on the wall, but it makes sense to me that Paul McCartney was apparently outvoted 3-1 about quitting touring. But with the Butcher cover, when the session took place, I think it was in Chelsea earlier on in 66, Epstein, when he looked at the proofs, was absolutely shocked by them and hated the sight of them. Tony Barrow quotes Epstein, again, we weren't there, only Barrow was, but Barrow's assertion is that Brian Epstein said to him, I feel like taking the cigarette lighter out of my pocket and setting fire to these negatives, but he didn't, of course. The other interesting thing about Yesterday and Today, by the way, is that by this time, Dave Dexter has been fired, and a guy called Bill Miller has taken over as their sort of American producer in inverted commas. Now, Bill Miller is a chip off the old Dexter block, but one thing he does very differently is he's a born diplomat, unlike Dave Dexter, the sort of southerner from Kansas City. Miller, his view is it's not what you do, it's the way you do it. So he clearly goes out of, and all the documents point to this, goes out of his way to consult the Beatles and Epstein before the concept of the album has been knitted together. And we know that not just because of Capitol documents, but because there was a letter that George Harrison wrote to a DJ in Georgia that he'd got very pally with in an earlier tour, where he talks about a host of things and signs off by talking about, this new album that Capitol are putting out. And he talks about the tracks on there and everything else. He wouldn't have known that unless Miller had given him a really strong heads up about it. And he'd even asked them, because there'd been a Barney in the past about the Dave Dexter sleeves and all the rest of it. So Bill Miller apparently said to Epstein, look, Brian, you talk to the Beatles and ask them what they want on the front cover of this next album, obviously, don't ask a question if you're not prepared to go with the answer. Obviously Brian Epstein makes the mistake of asking them, and John Lennon says, here's a good picture, this is something from that session. And obviously once the blood returns to Brian Epstein's face, he's then got to go through with it. I think according to the story, he chooses what he thinks is the least offensive version of that, because obviously there are over 20 different shots of that scene. So he chooses what he thinks is the least offensive, sends it off to Capitol. That the sort of avant-garde head of the Capitol art department actually thinks it's great. It's not as if they look at it and think, oh, what the hell is that? He thinks, oh, it's really arty and avant-garde.
It's brave. Provocative,
it's brave, and all the rest of it. So they rig it up. They've all the titles are chosen and all the rest of it. But it's only obviously when the poor infantry who have to hit the streets and sell this to the record stores start ringing up within hours of release, saying the people on the streets are not buying this. The record stores that I've sold thousands of dollars worth of stock to in the past are just saying, there's the door. We're not buying that. It might be the Beatles, but that's offensive. When we look at it today, we say, what's the problem? It's totally inoffensive to the 21st century eye, but to the 1966 American public, no way. So it's a very interesting story, really, and I think it sums up 66. It sums up this sort of tortured relationship between Epstein and the Beatles and Capitol. So one album almost sums everything up, really, I think.
It's that point of change. As you say, they're giving up touring. They brought out Revolver, which
Mm.
was provocative in itself. It was a big change.
Yeah, yeah.
But the stopping of the touring, so Brian's role is sort of decreased a little bit.
Mm,
Now,
mm.
as you're saying, they've got the money in, they've got the power, they can do whatever the hell they want in Abbey
Absolutely.
Road now.
Mm, yeah.
And
Mm,
Paul and John, particularly, have always had this avant-garde love for the
mm,
arty thing. So you can see that. But if you compare it to other album sleeves
mm.
of the time, it stands out because a lot
Oh,
of
it does. Yeah,
there's still just it's pictures of the band
yeah,
members smiling
yeah.
in a slightly
Yeah.
different place.
Yeah.
That's all. It's
Absolutely, yeah. It's the typical British, stiff upper lip album sleeve. You go through a bunch of photos, but all EMI, whether it's Cliff Richard, Adam Faith, Freddie and the Dreamers,
yeah,
they're all the same. I think it's one bloke just knocking off all these album sleeves. But as you say, it's really an incredible sleeve, and it sort of points to the future. And of course, by this stage, Capitol, although there's no contractual arrangement yet, Capitol, Bill Miller has sort of bent the knee and
yeah.
say, well, yeah, we're just use your EMI sleeves, guys. We don't want to rock the boat. Lovely sleeve. He probably was probably scratching his head for about a week trying to understand what the Revolver sleeve was all about. But for him, it didn't really matter. It was
No,
all about product.
yeah. So what happened to Dave Dexter then? Because
Well,
obviously,
Dave Dexter, sure. I mean, Dave Dexter. I mean, some people at Capitol were saying he was like the cat with nine lives. Unfortunately, by early '66, his ninth life had gone. And I think this kind of looking at all the paperwork, it kind of corresponds with this big Barney about Epstein contacting Alan Livingston and saying, "Oh, the boys want to make sure that in future you're not making up your own album sleeves. You're going with the London ones." And Dexter is really hot under the collar about that, and because he's a very straightforward, honest bloke, but he's not a diplomat. He would have lasted about 2 minutes in the diplomatic corps. So not only does he annoy Epstein and Beatles by digging in his feet on it, but he more importantly he's now for the first time burnt his bridges with Livingston and the board, because they know they're looking at their watches and they're thinking it's early '66. By the end of this year, that EMI contract is up for grabs again, and we don't want to lose the biggest earning act on the planet just
yeah,
because Dave Dexter's sticking his tongue out at the Beatles saying, your London sleeves are old rubbish. We know what we're doing. That might have been okay 2 years ago, but this record deal's up for negotiation in 6 months' time. You're not going to blow it, Dave. In fact, you're not even going to be on the case anymore. We're firing you. He stays within Capitol, but he's
okay,
literally put in this dark room on the top near the top floor, and he's now in charge of the Capitol re-releases department, which, as far as I can see, was basically him, and in this
yeah,
dark room. And it wasn't. He was like put into exile. So poor old Dave. He's shunted off. An
yeah.
awful lot of people who worked at Capitol really sympathised and thought he'd been, they'd done the dirty on him, which I think they had, to be honest. But they weren't going to let anyone stand in the way, even if it was their number one producer. No one was going to be allowed to jeopardise the deal in as they saw it in late '66. As you know, it didn't happen until early '67, but they didn't know that at the time,
No,
so they just weren't prepared to do anything or say anything that was going to upset or rock the
yeah,
apple cart, as they say.
yeah,
So yeah, I think that's really what happened. Bill Miller plays it gently. You mentioned Revolver earlier. I mean, a number of people I spoke to reckoned that, whether this is true or not, I have no idea, but there was certainly a strong view that George Martin had pretty much put a stick of dynamite underneath good old Bill, because he's three tracks short. when he adds everything up for Yesterday and Today, he's 3 tracks short. Just as Dexter was with Beatles 6, Dexter sends a cable to London and says, "Can you send me 3 brand new songs for Beatles 6?" Which they do, and he says the same thing to EMI. I'm 3 short. So what does George Martin do? Obviously, the Beatles are recording Revolver at the time, so he sends him the masters of 3 songs, but they're John Lennon songs. And the people that I spoke to, well, 2 of them anyway, said that George Martin must have known what the logical repercussion of doing that was. If you give Bill Miller 3 John Lennon songs, clearly he can't then reuse them on Revolver 4 months later. So those 3 John Lennon songs do not appear on Revolver. That means on the American Revolver, there's only 2 John Lennon songs on the album. George Harrison has got more tracks on Revolver,
Wow.
the US album, than John
Yeah.
Lennon. And John Lennon apparently, goes off like a nuclear weapon when he realizes he's only got 2 songs on the American Revolver. And Bill Miller is, literally almost put on a bonfire over it. The only thing that saves Bill Miller is that, you then get the Bigger Than Jesus thing blowing up,
Yeah.
and the spotlight and the heat is then actually on John Lennon, and
Yeah.
Bill Miller manages to creep off when no one's looking and escape the retribution from Epstein and John Lennon and all the rest of it. That's because a bigger crisis has blown up.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I mean, I can't. I suppose Bill Miller, he wouldn't have known that they were John Lennon songs because,
No.
in those days, it was Lennon. Everybody believed it's Lennon and McCartney.
It's 50-50,
as
isn't
far
it?
as he was concerned, he'd been given 3 Lennon and McCartney songs by George Martin. He can't be blamed for knowing that they were actually John Lennon tracks. Martin could have given him, I mean, there was a couple of Paul McCartney's in the can, there was a couple of George Harrison songs in the can by that stage. So it wasn't as if that, the only songs that Martin had to give Miller were John Lennon ones.
Yeah.
Was it just a coincidence that he gave Miller 3 John Lennons? Let the jury decide that. No, all the people involved are sadly no longer with us. But that's the view that I think a number of people at Capitol Tower felt later, that this was, because I think the view there, and it's probably true, was that George Martin apparently, according to Capitol, loathed Capitol for various different reasons, loathed them. And I think part of that goes to the way he believes he was treated when he accompanies them to the States in February '64. He thinks Capitol are pushing him to one side. He's not, they're not taking my photograph and all this kind of stuff. They're pushing journalists away from me. Maybe it was true. Maybe it's just, it's just been a bit touchy. I've no idea, but yeah, this is yet another dimension to what makes Yesterday and Today interesting. This sort of 3-track John Lennon thing, but yeah, it's a story all on its own, I think, isn't it? Yesterday and Today.
I mean, with that, contract up for renewal, it makes sense for the Bill Miller approach.
Yeah.
Because they want to do everything to say, well, if we're doing this, we're being so kind, I know you're going to sign, aren't you? As opposed to the aggressive approach, because they wouldn't want to lose that.
No, absolutely not. And as I say, Capitol completely changed tack and literally removed Dexter from the picture. But as I say, by that time there were much bigger things going on in late '66. But which is probably one of the reasons why. I mean, again, Jeffrey Ellis talks to this as well about these prolonged negotiations that start in the summer of '66, and by the end of '66 they're still going on, and Epstein doesn't seem to have made an awful lot of progress getting a better deal. It is a better deal, but not a massively better deal, and obviously Klein later, says, well, it's just a slight improvement on an awful deal. And he tries to, as a meeting with Lockwood, tries to get a better deal in '69, and Lockwood says to Klein, apparently, well, the Beatles are off the boil now, old boy, we're not interested in improving the contract. Is Klein bothered? He's not, because he knows that the UK record market, as we said earlier, is a little bit of a microcosm. So he says, well, don't worry, Sir Joseph, but by the way, we'll have to agree to disagree, but you don't mind me going to see Alan Livingston and striking a separate deal with Capitol, do you? And Lockwood probably thinks, well, why would I? I'm not interested anymore. The Beatles are on the wane. So he goes to Capitol, goes to Livingston, and negotiates an absolutely stonking deal,
Yeah.
very similar to the Rolling Stones one. And I think even Paul McCartney grudgingly said, well, that's a bloody good deal that Klein has struck with Capitol. So yeah, they got a decent deal in the end. But it was probably more down to Alan Klein, dare we say, than
Well,
anybody else.
but again, that's the beauty of examining history, like we were saying before, isn't it? You
Yeah,
know
yeah.
that Alan Klein's the pantomime villain,
He is, yeah,
but
yeah,
you can see why
yeah,
John's head would have been turned by him because of what
mm,
Mick and Keith were saying.
yeah,
Because the
yeah,
deal was rubbish that they had with
yes,
EMI.
yeah, yeah. And I think as well, Klein was a very outspoken guy, and would have, just the kind of person John Lennon would have shone to. So
Yeah,
he pressed all the right buttons with John Lennon. And again, there's another bit in the book that I just couldn't resist putting in the book, which is when Klein comes to London in '64 and tries to persuade Brian Epstein to sell the Beatles to him, to let him become the Beatles manager. Of course, as we obviously know, it doesn't happen. But
yeah,
he'd got a plan B. He wanted a bite out of this British invasion thing. So he'd got a meeting the following day with Mickey Most, and he strikes a deal with Mickey Most, and he's got the Animals and all these other bands. So and again, that's how Andrew Oldham gets to hear all these amazing things
of course.
from Mickey Most about Alan Klein, and how he sort of waves a stick and money appears out of thin air and stuff like this. So yeah, he's a fascinating. Him and Dexter should have got together, I think, at some point.
Wow,
Obviously, they never did, but they
that
were
would have
very
been
similar.
interesting.
It would have been. It would have been, wouldn't it? Yeah. But
So, what was no? Looking at the whole of the story, what leapt out to you as something that either surprised you, or we were saying before about following the
mm,
evidence.
yeah,
What really jumped out and think, oh wow, that's really changed what I was
yeah,
thinking.
yeah. I think that's your toughest question that you've just asked me there. I think there are possibly two answers to that. I mean, number one isn't a specific answer, but I think the whole way that the capital relationship worked, this sort of almost like a sort of a madmen, but it's records, not ads, and all the rest of it. So the way Capital worked, I wouldn't go so far as to say it was cynical, because they probably weren't doing anything massively different from any other record company. But I mean, again, I loved that example that I came across about when the Beatles were on the Ed Sullivan show. Capital, I think, there were 2 days during their visit when there was nothing going on. So they said, oh, is there anything that you're burning to do? And apparently they'd already said before to Epstein, oh, we want to meet Sonny Liston. He's the world heavyweight boxing champion. John Lennon apparently loved Sonny Liston. He thought he was a man of the people and all this kind of stuff. So they said, oh, we've got to meet Sonny Liston. So they said, all right, boys, leave it to us. And they go away and they speak to Liston's manager. Liston's manager doesn't even return the phone call. So in the end, they get I think it's the manager of the hotel they're staying in at Miami Beach, and he gets someone to bring Liston to the bring Sonny Liston to the Sullivan show. And afterwards, somebody says to him, "Oh, so what do you think then, Sonny? Do you want you meet the Beatles?" And what he comes out with obviously isn't repeatable, but I mean, he basically says, "I'm not having my photograph taken with those sissies." That's a paraphrasing what he said. So basically, he was refusing to meet them, but they had already arranged a photo shoot, or so they thought. And they couldn't cancel it because it was all arranged and everything else. But they daren't tell the Beatles that Sonny Liston was refusing to play ball. So they got in touch with Cassius Clay's manager, Muhammad Ali, but it was called Cassius Clay at the time.
Yeah,
And they said, look, how about doing a photo shoot with the Beatles, which was manna from heaven. I mean, Clay was and his management were very, very media savvy.
yeah.
So they arranged, for this photo shoot at the Fifth Street gym with the Dundee brothers. But even as the Beatles were being sort of pushed into the limo the next morning to go off there, they still thought they were going to Sonny Liston's gym.
Oh,
When
wow.
they turn up at the gym, the photographer finally decides, the moment has come to break the news that we're not at Sonny Liston's gym. It's Cassius Clay. John Lennon says something which I'll politely paraphrase, which is something like, "Oh no, not that." Dada loser and all the rest of it. We don't want to be our photographs taken anywhere near this bloke. And what's more, Clay's actually late appearing to welcome them. So they're just about, a mouthful of expletives to the photographer and just about to walk out and jump back in the limo when Clay appears. So they then have to suddenly click into, the smiley,
Yeah.
oh, let's take the pictures. So they take all those iconic photos,
Yeah.
in the ring with Clay and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, walk out, give the photographer another tongue lashing, but he doesn't care because he's not paid to get tongue lashings. He's got
No.
the photos now, and he's off to his next assignment. And everybody pretty much forgets it. 2 days later, they're on the plane back to England. They're putting finishing touches to, I think, "Can't Buy Me Love" or whatever. And obviously, I think 25th of February, George Harrison's birthday. I think it's the 25th, or was it? Yeah.
25th, yeah.
So that's it. So George Harrison is having a midnight party for his birthday. What's happening in Miami Beach is Clay Liston fight. And as we all know now, against all the odds, Liston doesn't come out of the corner and Clay becomes world heavyweight champion.
Yeah.
What actually happens then is Capitol get on, ring all the guys or number of guys in the Capitol PR department, get to work an hour early tomorrow because we've got a problem, or we've got to turn it around. So what they do is they then issue a nationwide press release enclosing 3 of what they think are the best Clay Beatles photos and put out a statement saying, the Beatles were, I'm just paraphrasing it, we're ahead of the curve. Unlike everybody else, they knew that Clay was he's the man, and they asked for a special audience with Cassius Clay. They went along to the gym. They got these exclusive photos. Here are the photos. I mean, the Beatles were probably, I don't know what they're the way that Capitol has sort of twisted it, and it was a media coup because even today those photos are iconic photos. But it's like a number of other people have said, the Beatles, or certainly John Lennon, was always a Sonny Liston fan. And look at the front cover of Sergeant Pepper. When they were asked to nominate people, was old Muhammad Ali on Sergeant Pepper? No, it was Sonny Liston. So and I think that was probably the one that made me laugh the most.
That's great.
So it's the general way that the Capitol worked. It was like Mad Men. When I saw Mad Men, I thought, that's a good parallel.
Yeah. So let's tell the wonderful people where they can get your book from.
Sure. Well, what's the old phrase? All good bookshops, and I suppose some pretty bad bookshops as well. But I mean, Amazon is always the sort, I suppose, the quickest way. Press a few buttons and the book's yours. You don't even have to leave the comfort of your own bedroom to get it. But yes, that's the best way of getting it, I think.
Yeah. So Capitol Gains, fascinating story, fascinating. Thank you so much for spending your time and answering the questions. It's been real good fun. We'll spread the word. Best of luck with it. And
Thank you very much. Wonderful stuff. Thank you very much.
Take care. See you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.